I want to talk in this video about preferences. We hear a lot about preferences in non-duality, becoming preferenceless, getting rid of preferences, having no preferences, 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 preferences. And there's some nuance in preferences. Dog and cat are getting a little frisky. There's some nuance in preferences. It's not about getting rid of all of our preferences. It doesn't make you more enlightened to be totally preferenceless. I totally went through a phase where it was just like, I don't care, whatever, everything, yeah, no preference, no preference, no preference. And to a degree, that's still here, but the nuance in this, in preferences, is that it's not that preferences evaporate, it's that it's seen that preferences are empty. Preferences are inherently empty. But these characters naturally have preferences. I have a preference for living in the woods. I have a preference for a slow-paced life. Like, this character just kind of has hard wiring for certain preferences. I have preferences for food and flavors and clothing styles. So it's not that those things go away, but rather that the preferences themselves are seen to be inherently empty. And when I say that they're seen to be inherently empty, what I mean by that is that if those preferences are not met, or if life does not align or show up in a way that meets those preferences, it's not a problem, because the preferences are not clung to. There's no more identification with the preferences. The preferences are still there. I still have my preferences for certain types of foods, and, you know, I seem to be hardwired in a certain kind of way in terms of the ways that I relate to people or the things that I enjoy doing. There are preferences there, but, you know, if the preferences aren't met, it's totally fine. There's no longer suffering because it's seen that the preferences themselves are empty. The preferences are inherently empty. There's no one who has the preferences. There's just the preferences. There's no longer an unconscious belief that the preferences are me. That's the difference. And so in that, seeing the emptiness of the preferences, the suffering goes away. And so I will speak to this in terms of human relating, because that seems to be a really sticky spot where these types of things show up. And I'll just kind of give you an example of, from my own life, is that for whatever reason, this Jennifer character, the way that Jennifers, seems to have a preference for long-term committed relationship. That's just kind of how this thing seems to be wired. That's just the aliveness of how Jennifer seems to show up. And, as human beings, like, we have preferences for things. So the way that this thing used to operate when there was a lot of identification with the preferences is that there was still that orientation, but there was so much fear and so much identification with it that what was alive for me, or what was appearing in any given moment, maybe like emotionally or interpersonally, would kind of be shoved down because there was such a fear of losing like a partnership, or losing a potential for a partnership, or losing a romantic interest, or, there was just like such a gripping towards this preference, so much fear, of not having that preference met, that there was a ton of suffering. And at this point, there's the preference, but then if something doesn't align that way, it's totally fine. You know, if there's like some sort of connection that dissolves because there's a truth that's spoken here, like that's no longer a problem. It's literally no longer a problem. Because the preference has been seen to be empty. Does that make sense? So the way that this Jennifer character shows up is still very much has preferences, you know, and will speak those preferences very, very openly. And then if life goes another way, or if the preferences aren't met, it's okay. No suffering anymore. So there's this way that I see a lot of folks kind of in the non-duality world, or a lot of people kind of moving through an awakening process, who negate all the preferences, or kind of sneakily, like unconsciously, begin to identify as someone with no preferences. So there's an identification with not having preferences. Do you see the trap there? There's a preference, a secret preference for not having preferences. There's a gripping at not gripping. Secretly, you know? So it's not trying to get rid of preferences or to convince ourselves that we shouldn't have preferences. But it's rather being honest with ourselves when those preferences arise. And in every moment when a preference is not met is an opportunity. So if a preference is not met, there's an opportunity in that moment to pause, maybe close the eyes, to feel into the sensations in the body, and to notice the reaction to life not aligning with that preference. And if there's like, oftentimes there will be like a contraction or a tension. And that's a signal of identification with a preference, of wanting life to be the way that we want it to be, of being identified. So there's an opportunity to drop into the sensation. So preference and, you know, like shouldn't, and the gripping, like a lot of that happens in the mind, but there's an opportunity to kind of reorient to sensation in those moments, to drop into any contraction that may be present in the body when life doesn't align with those preferences, and to follow it down and allow those stories to come forth. Not to get, you know, swept up in them, but to find a presence with them and allow the bits of identification to release. And this can be actually helpful. You know, this type of stuff, at least in my own experience, it was most helpful to have someone hold that presence for me versus trying to hold it for myself while also doing that investigation. And as this has progressed, you know, as that presence has become more of just the natural operating state, and that stillness and that inherent emptiness, like that's just the way that this thing moves now, and it's so attuned to that it's become much easier to drop into that presence and investigate simultaneously. But initially, I really needed that, you know, another person to kind of hold that space and be that grounding presence as those things were explored. And so I still have a really great therapist who is very much attuned to this world. And, you know, I do sessions with people And really it's just to hold that presence. And it's not that you don't have it too. It's just that as we kind of unwind those stories and unhook those hooks, like the presence gets uncovered. The presence is buried under all those things. It's already there though. It's what you are. You know, it's what you really are when you start to see through the preferences and see that the preferences are not actually you. Preferences are empty. So I guess all this to say is it's a sneaky little trap. Preferences are a sneaky little trap. Preferences don't go away. And if you believe that you are totally preferenceless, maybe kind of investigate whether you have subtly identified as someone who has no preferences, as a self with no preferences. And what is the resistance to the preferences? There's no problem with preferences. Preferences are no longer a problem. Life not meeting preferences is no longer a problem. That's the difference. It's not, the preferences don't go away. The humanness doesn't go away. The humanness can't be hopped over. We don't permanently transcend being a human being. It's just the human beingness, the identification with that is seen to be empty. The self is seen to be empty. The ego is seen to be empty. Thoughts are seen to be empty. Emotions are seen to be empty. But that does not mean to negate them. That does not mean that they do not arise. They are just not a problem. So don't make the mistake of pushing them away, because they're just going to keep surfacing. Luna's very lazily growling right now on the porch. She's on her exhales. Super lazy. So what you really are is the emptiness, the silence, the presence within which the preferences arise. But you have to kind of dig through all the surface stuff and figure out everything that you're not in order to settle into what you actually are. It takes time and it's uncomfortable. And don't be ashamed to need help, you know. That was a hard one for me, was asking for help, admitting that like I needed help. I needed somebody else to hold that space for me. And it was immense. It was immensely helpful. It was instrumental, in fact, instrumental to my process. I didn't do it alone. I was at one point attached to trying to do it alone, but then that's being attached to being solitary, and all of that is the foundation of all of that is being attached to a me who is separate, who is an individual. And all that has to be let go of. So any places where there's stickiness happening or where there's a resistance are pointing to places where there's still hooks, identity hooks, where there's still preferences or wanting life to be the way that our preferences dictate. And awakening is seeing the emptiness of the preferences. So have your preferences. Just don't, we learn not to take them seriously. But negating them, or saying like, negating them and trying to push them away when we are still identified with them as a bypass. So there's just a lot of like deep nuance here. And I've done all the things. I've done all the bypassing. I've done all the resisting. I've done all the pushing away. Like I've done all the stuff. So I'm very familiar with all the ways that can be avoided and run from, and all the little slippery traps, because it's like, did that. Oh, did that one too. Yep, sure did. That's all I have. Peace.